All right, this lesson we're going to look at factoring trinomials again, but a little bit different from our previous one. We're going to do factoring trinomials when our leading coefficient, that a value, is not 1. Before we do that, let's go ahead and review factoring and what that represents. So really we're looking at the kind of the opposite process of multiplying. So if we were to multiply these two, 2x times x is 2x squared, 2x times 10 is 20x. And then 5 times x is 5x, and then 5 times 10 is 50, and then we can combine like terms. So that would be 25x plus 50. So really, again, when we say factor, we're going to be given an expression, and we're going to find things that multiply to be that expression. Now, I guess we could guess and check. Now, certainly if we're given one of the factors, it should be easy to find the other factor. So like a number 2 kind of explores that idea a little bit. So if we're given this expression here, 16c squared minus 30c plus 9, and we're gonna if we're gonna factor that, well, if one of the factors is 2c minus 3, let's say if you knew that one, we should be able to come up with the entire other factor, because what we want to say is we want 2c times something, and that's got to equal 16c squared. So that's got to be 8c. So 2c times 8c is 16c squared, and we can double check the other one. 2c times a negative 3 is negative 6c. And then we can go ahead and distribute the negative 3. So that's negative 24c. And then negative 3 times negative 3 is a positive 9. And then we combine like terms and we get that. So number 2 and 3 is just, again, making sure we understand the multiplication process. So number 3, we have 22t squared minus 29t minus 6. So if one of the factors is 11t plus 2, again, we didn't even have to have that 2t. We can do that problem without it, because 11t times something has to be 22t squared. And then we also, when we think about this last number here, that negative 6, that's 2, positive 2 times something, and that's got to be negative 3. I guess we can divide to do that. So number 2 and 3, the point is, again, just familiarizing ourselves with that multiplication process. And we could, if we're going backwards and factoring, we could guess and check, but we're going to come up with a system of doing that. So this example has that. So again, this works for when we have trinomials, 3 terms. And really the key is also this right here, where those exponents have that, the second exponent there, n, has to be half of m. So when that is, really we're going to combine 2 techniques, the last 2 techniques that we just learned. So one with trinomials and the other one is with grouping when we have four factors. So that's really the goal, is to change this problem to 4 terms. So to do that, to change it to 4 terms, to change that problem, first thing is we're going to multiply a times c. So we're going to multiply those 2 numbers, that leading coefficient times the constant, and we get negative 60 in this case. And then once we have that number, this becomes like the lesson we just did with trinomials, where the a value is 1. That same process, we're going to do the product and sum technique pattern. So let's list all the factors of negative 60 and then start adding them as we go. So we have 1 times negative 60. If we add those, we get negative 59. 2 times negative 30 equals negative 60. If we add those, we get negative 27. And we keep going until we get that middle term, that b value there. So when did we get negative 7? That's right there. And then so we just stop. We don't have to keep going with factors after that once we find those 2 numbers. Okay. So once we find those 2 numbers, that 5 times negative 12 is negative 60. 5 plus negative 12 is that b value, that middle term. Once we have those 2 numbers, we're going to change the problem. Okay. So what we were given is right there, and we're going to change that problem, and we're going to change it using those 2 numbers and changing the middle term. So that negative 7x, we're going to change that to 5x minus 12x. And certainly if we went backwards, you can see that that's true. 5x minus 12x is negative 7x. So we're not changing the value, we're just rewriting it a different way. All right, once we've changed it to 4 terms, we're just going to do what we did with 4 terms, and that was that grouping method. grouping method, again, we're just doing the GCF a few times. So first we're going to look at the GCF of those first two terms. So the biggest thing we can divide both of those by is 5x. So once we find that that GCF, we divide by that. So 5x divided into 20x squared is 4x, and 5x divided by 5x is 4x plus 1. So we did the GCF of the first two. We'll bring down that sign value, and we'll do the GCF of the last two. So the biggest thing we can divide both 12x and 3 by is 3. And so really we're dividing by that. You got to keep that sign out in front. We're going to divide both of those terms by negative 3. So negative 12x divided by negative 3 is 4x, and negative 3 divided by negative 3 is 1. And so what we'll notice is those two are the same. Now, once we've done the GCF of the first two, the last two, so again, we're going to do the GCF of these two terms. So the two terms are separated by addition and subtraction. So the thing that we can divide both of those by is 4x plus 1. So I'll go ahead and put that. That's our GCF. So we'll put the GCF on the outside, and then we'll divide by the GCF. Okay, so if I divide this 4x plus 1 to this first term, I am left with 5x. And if I divide 4x plus 1 into the second term, 4x plus 1 divided by 4x plus 1 is 1, and we're left with just that 3 there. And so that is our final answer. So number 4, let's try this one. So again, our first step would be to multiply the leading coefficient and the constant. So 4 times 30 is 120. And so we want to figure out the factors of 120, and the sum has to be 43. Okay, so we can just, you may, again, think of it right away, but we'll start listing them. 1 times 120. Well, if we add those, that's 121. 2 times 60. If we add those, that's 62. 3 divides into 120 40 times, and that is 43. And we can stop right there because that's what we're looking for. So those two factors are 3 and 40. So we're going to use those two numbers, 3 and 40, to rewrite that expression. So we have 4y squared. Now instead of 43, we're going to write 3y plus 40y. And it doesn't matter which one we write first. And then plus 30. So you can see 3y plus 40y is 43y, so that doesn't change anything. Now that we have 4 terms, we can go ahead and do GCF 3 times, so we can do that grouping method. So if we do the GCF of the first 2 terms, that's right here, the biggest thing we can divide both of those terms by is y. And after we do that, we're left with 4y plus 3. Okay, then we'll bring down that plus sign right there, and then we'll look at the next one. So the biggest thing we can divide both 40y and 30y by is 10. And so when we divide both of those terms by 10, so 40y divided by 10 is 4y, and then 10 divides into 30 3 times. Okay, so we did the GCF of the first 2 terms, the last 2 terms, and then we'll do GCF again, and we'll notice that we can divide both of those terms by 4y plus 3. So 4y plus 3. Okay, so we'll divide this term by 4y plus 3, and we are left with y. And then we'll divide the second term right there by 4y plus 3. So if we divide the entire thing by 4y plus 3, we're left with 10. Okay, and again, we can multiply those to double check that this is correct by just distributing the 4y. So that's 4y squared plus 10y, 3y, and then 3 times 10 is 30. And again, combine those and we do get the correct answer on that. And I apologize, that should have been a 40y there. I missed the part of the 4. So 4y times y, and then 4y times 10. And then again 3y, and then 3 times 10 is 30. All right, so number 5, again, that same idea. So we're going to multiply those two. So when we multiply those two numbers there, we get 70. Okay, so we want two numbers that multiply to be 70, and their sum has to be negative 17. So to get a positive 70, that's either a negative times a negative or a positive times a negative, or positive times a positive, or negative times a negative. All right, so to get negative 17, they both have to be negative. So we can just kind of start listing those. And the sum of that's negative 71. All right, the next thing is negative 2. So we can do this kind of systematically, and that's negative 37. Because that's 2 times 35. 3 doesn't divide in there. 4 doesn't divide in there. So again, we can do 5, but hopefully at some point you maybe just say, all right, that's 7. So negative 7 times negative 10. By the way, if it doesn't pop in your head, try 5 and just do a calculator and do 70 divided by 5. So it's fine to use it, guess and check. So if you said 5, does 5 work? 70 divided by 5 is 14. And we add those up, that's negative 19. 70 divided by 6 does not work, so do 70 divided by 7, and that does work. Okay, so again, that's those two numbers that we're going to use to expand this to 4 terms, so 10y squared, and then we're going to change that negative 17y to negative 7y minus 10y, and then that plus 7 at the end. Okay, we did that so we can do GCF of those terms. So we're going to look for the biggest number we can divide those first two by, and that's y. And when we do divide those, we get 10y minus 7. And then we'll do the GCF of the next two. Remember, we'll just bring down that subtraction. Okay, and then the GCF of the next two is just 1. So we're dividing by negative 1. So negative 10y divided by negative 1 is 10y. And negative, or 7 divided by negative 1 is negative 7. Okay. And so what we'll notice is, again, those two terms both have a 10y minus 7, so that is our kind of our new GCF there. So 10y minus 7, and if we divide both of those terms by 10y minus 7, we're left with y minus 1. So again, we divide that by 10, this term by 10 minus 7, the next term by 10 minus 7, and that's how we get that result right there. All right, a few more examples. So number 6, again, that first step, we're just going to kind of move hopefully a little bit quicker, so start multiplying those. So the product has to be is negative 24, so we're going to find factors of negative 24. The sum has to be 8. So let's figure out the sum. So to get a negative, we do a negative times a positive, so negative 1 times 24. The sum of that is 23. Let's try negative 2 times 12, and that would be 10. Next, let's see, 3. And again, as you're doing these, you can use a calculator to double check. 24 divided by 3. If you don't have those down, that's 8. If we add those together, we get 5. We could do 4 times negative 6, which is, or excuse me, negative 4 times 6, which is 2, and then that's pretty much it, because then we start repeating those numbers again. Since none of those combinations work to get that middle number, we're just going to say that is a prime expression. So in other words, we can't factor it. All right, a couple more examples, and we'll see why we're doing these examples in a bit here. So number 7, again, we just multiply those two. Yep. And if we, again, feel free to use a calculator. So 22 times negative 5 is negative 110. Okay, and we're looking at the sum of negative 53. Since it's negative, one has to be negative, the product there is negative. One has to be negative, one has to be positive. So again, we can start listing those. Now, since it has to equal negative 53, the negative will be the sign with the bigger one. Okay, so if we add those, that does not equal 53. So let's try 2. So 110 divided by 2 is 55, and that's negative. And right there, that's on our second one, 53. Okay, so those are our two numbers. So we're going to go ahead and copy that expression again, 22b squared. And then instead of that negative 53b, we're going to put both of those. It is best, I recommend doing the negative one first if one's negative and one's positive, but it's not necessary. But I think it does help with a mistake that's very common. All right, and then we'll bring down that negative 5. So probably keep that the same. Okay, so plus 2b. All right, so once we change it to 4 terms, we're going to do a grouping. So we're going to do the GCF of those first 2 terms, and that is 11b. If we factor out 11b, we're left with 2b minus 5. Okay, and then plus, bring that plus down, GCF of 2b minus 5, that we can only divide by 1, so we'll put that there. And when we divide by 1, that doesn't do anything in terms of changing the numbers. Okay, and then again, we'll notice that they both have that same factor, so that's a GCF. GCF goes on the outside. Okay, and then if we divide both of those terms, if we divide this term by 2b minus 5, we are left with 11b. And then if we divide the second term by 2b minus 5, we're left with plus 1. And there we go, we have it factored. All right, 2 more quick problems here. So the first one on here, actually, if we do have a leading value that is negative, our first step is actually we're going to want to factor out a negative and change that. So we'll put that negative 1 on the outside, and we're going to change that. So when you divide by negative, that changes all the sign values. So now it's plus 4, and then we'll just go ahead and factor that as we would normally. I'll put that in. So we could, instead of putting negative 1, we could just put negative, and that's it. Okay, so again, I'll bring that negative 1 down. We don't have to put the 1. All right, we are going to look for factors of 36 that add up to be negative 15. Okay, so they're both negative. To get a negative times negative is a positive to get a sum that's negative. And again, you can just start listing them. All right, that's negative 37, negative 2 times negative 18. And that's going to be negative 20 is the sum, so that's not what we're looking for. Negative 3, and again, just use a calculator if you need to. 36 divided by negative 3 is negative 12. And if we add those together, we do get negative 15. Okay, so that's going to be the two, how we're going to separate that middle term. So we'll have 9x squared, and then we'll change that one right there, that negative 15x to be negative 3x minus 12x plus 4. Okay, so we changed that to a 4-term problem. We did that so that we can do difference of, GCF 3 times. So GCF of those first 2 would be 3x. So divide both of those terms by 3x, and we get 3x minus 1. Bring down that subtraction. Okay, and then we'll do the GCF of the next 2. So the greatest common factor of the next 2 is 4. So if we divide both of those really by negative 4, we're going to get, so negative 12x divided by negative 4 is positive 3x. And then positive 4 divided by negative 4 is negative 1. Okay, and then again, we can do GCF one more time with that one. So we still have that negative out in front. The GCF goes on the outside, 3x minus 1. And when we divide both of those by 3x minus 1, we're left with 3x minus 4. All right, and our last one here is just a review of factoring, or factoring to solve an equation. So now we have an equation, not an expression, and we'll do the same thing as before. We'll multiply those two, and we'll get negative 44. So factors of negative 44, whose sum is 20. That's what we're looking for, is that sum of 20. So again, that's 1 times 44, that does not work. All right, let's try 2. So negative 2 times 22, and that one does work. Negative 2 plus 22 is 20. So we'll use that to rewrite our equation. So minus 2n, so I'll do that in blue, minus 2n minus 22n minus 4 equals 0. All right, and let me do a little copy error. That should be plus 22. So again, that's negative 2 times positive 22. All right, and we did that so we can do the GCF of those first 2. The GCF of those first 2 is n. And when we divide by n, we're left with 11n minus 2. We'll bring down that plus sign right there. And then we'll do the GCF of the last 2. And the GCF of the last 2 is 2. So if we divide both of those terms by, those last two terms by 2, we're left with 11n minus 2. All right, and we'll notice that both of those have a 11n minus 2, so we'll factor that out. That is the GCF of each of those two terms. And if we divide that into both terms, we're left with n for the first one. Divide it into the second one, we're left with plus 2. And those are our two factors. And notice again, each step has an equal sign. All right, lastly, to solve, we're going to set each factor with a variable equal to 0. And then we're going to solve for the value of n. So we're going to add 2 to both sides and then divide by 11. This one will subtract 2. And there we go. We have solved for those.